20 years ago, I was sitting on the floor of my best friend Graham's dimly lit flat, being hypnotised. I've been hypnotised dozens of times before by Graham, but this time was a different experience. Graham didn't seem to be doing anything out of the ordinary, but an interesting thing about hypnosis is that even when you're hypnotised the same way time and time again, the experience can vary. Unknown to Graham or to myself at the start of the process, I was going to have an experience that I'd never had before and have only had once since, although I have had a related experience a couple of times, both through self-hypnosis and when hypnotised by Graham. Graham had me close my eyes, focus on the top of my head, relaxing my muscles around my head and face before moving my awareness down to my neck and slowly and gently moving my awareness down to the tips of my toes. He followed this up with having me focusing on the idea of finding myself standing at the top of a country garden, walking down 10 steps and into the garden, following a path through the garden and onto a gate at the back of the garden. Then passing through the gate and out into a secret garden, discovering a bench and taking some time to sit down on that bench. Something I struggle with is developing any kind of inner experience. Normally, whenever I engage in meditation or hypnosis or try to visualise, I have a sense of what's being asked of me. I can verbally describe something, but in my mind's eye, I usually just see darkness, and very occasionally I may see some faint moving colours in the dark. I don't see images, hear sounds, or feel anything. This doesn't detract from the experience. Some people report being disappointed or thinking that they can't be hypnotised or can't meditate because when they try, all they see is darkness in their mind. This is only a problem if the person thinks that it's a problem. It doesn't mean the person can't be hypnotised or can't meditate, just that they don't really have conscious experience of seeing, hearing or feeling things in their mind's eye. I had known this about myself for a long time, that I could describe things as if I had an inner experience that I was aware of, because I just trusted that I must have the inner experience. It's just that I'm not consciously aware of it. My reasoning was that if someone asked me what colour my front door was, for example, I'd be able to tell them the answer. If someone asked me to describe the layout of my flat, I could tell them the answer. To do this, I must be creating a representation of the front door or of my flat in my mind. And I'm drawing on this to give the answer. I just don't happen to be consciously aware of the inner sensory experience. On this day, my experience began exactly the same as it had every other time that I was hypnotised. I followed along to what Graham was saying and allowed myself to be absorbed in the experience. Graham and myself would regularly hypnotise each other for random reasons, usually in those early days for experimental reasons. These experimental reasons could vary from trying to evoke hypnotic phenomena like positive or negative hallucination, amnesia, hyperamnesia, anesthesia, analgesia, time distortion or automatic movement, or it could be exploring something unusual like past life regression, future progression, astral travelling or out-of-body experiences, or exploring some form of psychic phenomena. On this occasion, Graham was just going to hypnotise me and then encourage arm levitation. I'm generally a slow responder under hypnosis, which is very common among many people, that it takes time for non-conscious responses to develop, so Graham was going to have to closely observe my body language and watch for things like a slight movement in my arm or a slight twitch in the back of my hand, and carefully acknowledge these observations and encourage more until the micro movements become macro movements and my whole arm raises up into the air. It was probably going to take Graham about 20 to 30 minutes to elicit the arm levitation following the hypnotic induction, so I was expecting the experience to take about 15 minutes for the induction absorbing my attention, then 20 to 30 minutes to elicit the arm levitation, perhaps another 5 minutes of the arm levitation, and Graham linking the lowering of my arm with completing some inner work to take therapeutic advantage of the situation. Then perhaps 10 minutes of cool down, guiding me back to focusing on the garden before allowing me to reorientate myself back to the room in my own time. While Graham was doing this, I was focusing on the ongoing experience that I was having. My eyes were shut, so all I could see was darkness. At some point I drifted off into the experience, to the point where, for an unknown length of time, which felt like probably just a few moments, I was unaware of anything. I stopped talking to myself in my mind, and also stopped being aware of Graham's presence. Graham had likely paused briefly at this point to allow me time to drift deeper into the experience. My mind was silent, and I was alone in timeless darkness. This is an incredible state to be in, and one which I've entered a number of times, where my thoughts have been following along to the hypnotist and have become so tied to following the hypnotist that if they stop talking, I'm not talking to myself. I just have awareness. But with no visual or auditory cues, including no inner dialogue, there are no reference points to be aware of the passing of time. It could be 1 minute or 1 hour. The interesting thing about this state of mind is that once you acknowledge it in any way, other than just experiencing it, it's gone. If you think about anything like, this is interesting, for example, that's enough to end the experience. What happened this time, though, went one step further to something I'd never experienced before and have only experienced once since, although, as mentioned, I have experienced something similar a few times since, which I may cover in a future video. Without any suggestions from Graham for this to happen, I suddenly became aware that I could see as if my eyes were open. The same rules seemed to apply. As long as I was just having the experience, it remained. But as soon as I engaged with the experience or thought about the experience I was having, it disappeared in an instant and everything went black. It's difficult to explain, but I could look around and even seem to stand up and walk around, but I couldn't think about doing this. I just had to instinctively decide to do this. If I put any conscious thought into anything that I did, then the experience ended. So for the whole experience, there would be silence in my mind, and I felt like I was aware of the ongoing experience, but almost going along for the ride, not in control of the ongoing experience, and that holding on to the experience was very tenuous. I would describe it like wearing a virtual reality headset, where you can, as a character, be in a virtual world, and there's a programmed guide and you follow a route through this virtual world. You've no control over the route you seem to be taking, but unlike wearing a VR headset where you can move your head and look around as you follow the path, here all the head movements were automatic. I wasn't consciously deciding where to look. I just moved my head and looked. There was no inner dialogue. Any inner dialogue would end the experience. During the experience, everything seemed to be carrying on like normal. I could see Graham hypnotising me, I could see me being hypnotised, I could see seconds ticking by on the clock and on watches. I could see traffic passing by outside, but the moment I ended up having a thought, I was back in my body and could only see darkness. Following this experience, I spoke to Graham about what had happened. He told me that he'd had the same experience himself once before. We discussed this and tried to explore what caused me to have the experience now and whether we could replicate it with each other in the future. This led to our experiments with astral travel or remote viewing. If you're interested in me making a video about these experiments, then let me know in the comments below. My second experience was a couple of years later. It was summer. I was sat on a stone bench embedded in a wall which stretches along Bognor Regis seafront promenade. I frequently sat in this bench, enjoying relaxing by the sea. I also frequently sat on the beach while listening to self-hypnosis or meditation tracks. On this day I was listening to a Paul McKenna self-hypnosis track. I listened to Paul McKenna's tracks multiple times per day, nearly every day. I would listen sat on the beach, like I was here. I would listen when I was on bus journeys, going to or from work. I would listen when I was at home during the day. I would listen at bedtime before falling asleep. So I'd listened to these exact same self-hypnosis tracks dozens of times before, and As mentioned earlier, an interesting thing about hypnosis is that even when you're hypnotised the same way time and time again, like you are when listening to self-hypnosis tracks, the experience can vary. This time I was listening along, I was wearing in-ear headphones, but I could still hear the sound of the sea in the background, seagulls, bikes passing by, pedestrians walking past, pushchairs being pushed past me, and dogs being walked. I could feel the warmth of the sun on my face and experience the orangey-red glow of the sun's light through my closed eyelids. Paul McKenna's hypnotic induction progressed as usual, asking the listener to pay attention, to notice my breathing, and then to count backward from 300, 299, 298, 297, 296. And I followed along, counting down myself, occasionally losing track of what number I was on, and so I'd pick up roughly where I thought I was at, and then continue the countdown, while Paul McKenna continues to talk in the background. I gradually became more absorbed in the experience, before at some point suddenly finding that I could see as if my eyes were wide open. I didn't interrupt the experience or think about the experience, I just went along with the experience. I was aware that I could see the blue sky, seagulls flying overhead and walking on the stony beach, the brilliant blue sea with sparkling diamonds of light dancing on the surface of the water. I could see pedestrians walking past, some with dogs, others pushing pushchairs, and cyclists cycling along the promenade. After a few moments, I suddenly had a thought. Everything went black, and I immediately opened my eyes. As someone was walking past, I suddenly thought, is that person really dressed as I currently see them? When I was in the room with Graham, I knew what he looked like, what he was wearing, what his flat looked like. I was aware that perhaps the time that I can see was correct, because maybe I was able to non-consciously keep track of time. I thought the cars outside would have been going past too fast to be able to exit the state, get to the window, take a look and see if the car passing matched my inner experience. During the experience afterwards, when talking with Graham, I shared about these thoughts and that I wouldn't have gained anything by interrupting the experience. But here, now, I had something I could test. People walking past me were random people. I didn't know them, they weren't in view before I closed my eyes and started listening along to Paul McKenna's voice, so if this was created entirely in my mind, then some of this inner experience shouldn't match the real world. I may be able to non-consciously work out from the sounds that I can hear that there are seagulls walking on the stones and flying in the sky. I know what seagulls look like, so they would look about right. I may recognise the sounds of dogs, feet, and maybe be able to create fairly accurate looking dogs based on the sound of the walking and the panting alone, because I've observed hundreds of dogs over the years, so although consciously if I heard a dog walking past I wouldn't know what the dog looks like, maybe non-consciously I can take the rate and depth of panting, the frequency and speed of footsteps, etc., and match these with what I non-consciously know about dogs and visualise a dog which looks very close to the actual dog which passed by. I thought perhaps I'd be able to create a mental representation of a bike, which at a glance of the real thing I may not be able to tell the difference with, from the sound of the bike passing by, the size of the wheels, the tyres that are on the wheels, the sound of the pedalling, and what that can tell me about whether the bike has gears. So I thought it would make sense that I might be able to identify whether a bike was a racer or a mountain bike or a BMX bike or a smaller or a larger bike or a child's bike. But one thing I thought I'd be unlikely to know, or at least I couldn't think how I could easily know this with my eyes shut, is what a person walking past looks like. I might be able to tell what shoes they're wearing, and I might be able to have an educated guess at the colour of those shoes, just like with a bike. You can have an educated guess of a colour of a bike. But I didn't imagine that it would be possible to be able to work out a person's hair colour or the colour of the clothes that they're wearing. I opened my eyes and looked, and to my surprise everything looked the same. It seemed that people were wearing what I had seen them wearing. A woman walking by pushing a pushchair was wearing the same when I looked at her as she was when my eyes were closed. The pushchair looked the same. Others walking along looked the same. I couldn't notice any difference and had to move my head around and stand up to convince myself that I was definitely not still having that inner experience. I still had Paul McKenna talking into my ears, so I turned off my Walkman and just looked around me. Watching people walk past, I then sat down on the wall to try to figure this out. I went through the thinking process that I've just described about how I can logically see that it could be possible to identify dogs, bikes, shoes and seagulls, but I couldn't think of how I could identify clothes that someone was wearing and what colour their hair was. Frustratingly, I couldn't just close my eyes and have the inner experience again and then open my eyes and compare the two. These experiences were so strange and profound and unfortunately not something that I've been able to replicate by choice, and I haven't had the experience like these again since. I had nearly a decade of doing frequent self-hypnosis and meditation, and about 4 years of that being hypnotised frequently by Graham and others prior to the first experience. A couple of years more experience with hypnosis before the second experience, and then no further experiences like this in almost 20 years since that second experience. Over the next few years, Graham and myself progressed to looking into astral travelling or remote viewing, but that's for potentially another video. We never found what triggered the seeing with closed eyes experience and how to replicate that. I've shared my most plausible theory here that non-consciously we know a lot more than we realise, and so from minimal information we can infer a lot of reasonably accurate information, like taking information we can smell, feel and hear and filling in the visual blanks, like perhaps recognising that a dog passing by is an Alsatian by its panting, the sound of its footsteps, like how heavy the dog sounds from the footsteps and how wide the stride sounds and what size dog would have a stride that wide, and the distance between the sound of the front feet and the back feet taking steps, the spatial location of the panting, how high above the ground this is, and so how high the head must be, and other non-visual information, like maybe as the dog passes you notice the smell of the dog and recognise this. Then there's the more static elements like the sky and the beach. I obviously know what these look like. Shadows could cross my field of view, revealing the size of people passing by close enough to have cast shadows over my face, and then I could know roughly how tall they were based on how far away they sounded while they walked past me. I could detect shadows of clouds passing across the sun, giving me an idea of the types of clouds in the sky, how fast they're moving, and over a period of time, based on how many shadows pass across the sun, how cloudy the sky is likely to be for that frequency of cloud to have crossed the sun in that given time period. This theory can explain a lot about the experience. It can account for why the environment looks right. It can explain how I would know much of what's in the environment and why I would be able to create such an accurate representation of much of what I was observing with my eyes open. But it doesn't explain how I would know what colour clothes someone was wearing. And I don't believe that it would be possible for me to detect with my eyes closed that kind of information, especially not at a distance. I can understand recognising some of this close up, like having your eyes closed near a brick wall feels very different to having your eyes closed near a tree or near a chalk cliff or near a concrete pylon or metal door. You can feel the temperature of the material near you and smell the material near you, and so for these things I can understand that you might recognise what they would look like from the other sensory information. Even painted, you might smell the paint, notice the temperature difference between the paint, and something painted white or light will be cooler than something painted dark or black. And there are some common colours things get painted, so maybe if you detected that something was cooler than expected and seemed painted, then maybe it was painted light and you could deduce the most likely light colour that would be. I could understand potentially being able to recognise other materials in the same kind of way if they're close to you, like within centimetres of your face, but I can't imagine it being possible to do this with people walking many metres away from you. So I find that unless I'm significantly underselling human abilities, and we are far more capable with our senses than I'm giving credit for here, this isn't a wholly satisfactory explanation. But then the idea that the explanation is that we're actually seeing with our eyes closed would still need a theory of how this could be possible, that could be tested to find out if that is a suitable answer, and that would mean humans have this other capability that's more extraordinary to me than underselling how good our senses are. Even today, I find it fascinating and try to recreate the experience and hope that one day I have the experience again, and ideally that I can figure out how to cause the experience on purpose, and even better, how to make the experience more stable so that you can actively and consciously be engaged with that experience, not just experiencing it. What are your thoughts on this? Have you ever seen through closed eyes like this? Do you have any theories for the experience, or know of any ways to trigger this experience? If you do, share them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.